one of the things that I've always tried to do is bring this element of practical experience to my teaching. And not just general practical experience, but so that students in my business classes would have some sense of what it means to be a corporate lawyer. In order to start the clinic, the summer before it started, one of the things that I did was I talked with people who were running business clinics in different parts of the country and got an idea of what they did and what was working and what wasn't working. And the result was this really unique synthesis of other business clinics where I kind of tried to take the best parts from all of them and bring it here. So I want to talk a little bit about what's unique about our clinic. First of all, it's a transactional clinic. And what that means is that the students don't do anything litigation-oriented. They work on business problems. That's different than almost anything else. Almost anything else that students do involve litigation. They go to court, and that's great experience. They argue motions. They file something. We don't do that. We give them experience just on the business side of things. And what it does is it taps into a whole different range of students. So you have students who wouldn't otherwise have this clinical experience because they're geared toward corporate work, who are getting to do corporate work in the clinic. Also, it's an area where there's not a lot of outlets for pro bono work. Usually corporate law is antithetical to public interest, and yet we have students who are working with clients who need their help and they don't have the money to pay law firms. And so it's an outlet where students can actually do pro bono corporate work. We're different from a lot of clinics in different parts of the country, and I want to talk just a little bit about the decisions that I made and how that makes us different. Many of the clinics who call themselves business clinics only deal with nonprofits. Now, we deal with nonprofits, but we also deal with for-profit businesses. In addition, a lot of them, because of funding limits, will only work with businesses that are, or entrepreneurs that are below the poverty line. And they'll work in enterprise zones, and it's great work and it's really helpful, but it limits the access to the number of clients that you can have because there are not a ton of what I call indigent entrepreneurs. So in order to get at a good client base, we move a little higher. Now, we're not taking on wealthy businesses. We're not taking on, our mandate is if someone can afford to pay a law firm for services, they're not fit for the clinic. But there's a huge gap between I'm starting a business and I'm below the poverty line. There are also schools that call themselves clinics that aren't clinics. They just do hypothetical problems. And so students will work on fictional clients, but not on real clients. And to me, that takes out a lot of the value of clinical work. I also just want to briefly touch on why clinical work is different from an externship. Because students could go work in a law firm and do some of this work. But the thing is, you don't get the same level of supervision in a law firm, and you usually are working on a piece of a project. Their clients are going to be more sophisticated, more complicated, and you can do a little piece of something, but you can't have the responsibility that our students get. I want to talk a little bit about what a typical student experiences in the clinic. So our students commit for a year to the clinic. And each semester they will carry 3 to 4 matters, and they vary in complexity. We will usually, or I'll usually start them off on a relatively simple matter, maybe incorporating a business. And then as they progress in their understanding, they'll move on to an LLC or they'll work on a nonprofit, and they'll finally progress to drafting agreements, so that during the course of their year in the clinic, their exposure to work increases as their ability to handle more complex matters grows. and they're handling more than one matter at a time. Students are always assigned to one matter per student so that they have responsibility for it. And what's amazing about this is they are getting this experience that people don't have in a law firm till they're third or fourth year associates. They're responsible for the clients, they're talking to the clients, they are shepherding the clients through all of the work that needs to be done. I'm in the background and I interact with the students on a weekly, well, much more than a weekly basis, but we have meetings once a week individually to make sure that they're following a good path. We have group meetings, which is kind of like there's some substantive aspect to it, but there's also an LA Law aspect to it where we'll sit around and talk about our cases so that there can be cross-pollination. We'll say, what are you working on? What are you having trouble with? How did you resolve it? So that another student could say, oh, that was a great way to handle it. Maybe I can talk to them if I have a matter. The other thing that to me is the secret part of the clinic is the non-substantive areas. So students in the small business clinic are learning to do incorporations. They're learning all the rules about whether something should be an LLC or an S corporation. But they're also learning how to write an email to a client and how to talk to a client and how to manage a client. And I never would have known this before I started working with students in the clinical world, but there's so much that they don't know that they need to learn. I mean, there was a student where I just had to explain you can't write a letter to the client, an email, and sign it fondly. By the way, I got it. It was a really great client. I had fond feelings for the client as well. And I never would have known that you have to explain that to someone. And it's little things like that that sneak up every day that's part of the curriculum when you're dealing with real live situations. I have some handouts that talk about kind of the projects that we do and the types of work that we undertake. There's incorporations and there's LLCs and there's nonprofits, and we file documents with the IRS to get tax ID numbers, and we'll do shareholders agreements, and you can read the list at your leisure. I won't read it for you. But what I thought I would do is I would take you through 2 sample clients and talk about what students had done for those clients to really give you a sense of what the experience is like. So just to be clear, I'm only talking about stuff that's in the public domain or things that I have cleared with the client, because one of the things that we stress is attorney-client privilege and confidentiality. So all of this is pre-approved to disclose. So the first client that's a good example of what we do is called SNAP. And SNAP stands for Screen Now and Prevent Program. And SNAP is a program that was actually started in the medical school at USC. And we received an application from a medical student telling us about this program that they run, where medical students once a month would set up a clinic across the, in a church across the street from the medical school, and open their doors and screen neighborhood individuals for diabetes. And maybe there was a little bit of health counseling, and they had been run through the medical school, but they wanted to create an independent 501c3 entity to carry forward. So they filled out an application, we approved the application, it was assigned to a student, and the student and I then sit down at an intake meeting with the medical student or the client to talk about the project. And we talk about what the small business clinic can do and what it can't do. And out of that meeting comes a defined project. In this case, it was forming the 501c3. The student then prepares an engagement letter, which is the equivalent of a retainer agreement that you would sign with a law firm, except we don't get a retainer. But it has a lot of limitations of what we do, and it has exculpatory language in case someone says, wait, you're handling this, and we say, no, we weren't, and sends that out to the client. And when we get that back, then we start work. So for this project, that meant that the student then prepared articles of incorporation, sent them to the client, had them approved and filed, and then created bylaws, And for bylaws of a nonprofit, it's not like bylaws of a profit company. In a nonprofit, the bylaws are the constitution that really define what happens. So you don't just send them a document and say, oh, here's the bylaws. Isn't that great? What you do is you sit down with the client and say, how do you want this 501c3 to operate? And that means things like medical students graduate. So who's going to be on the board of directors? How are you going to select the people for the future? What choices do you want to make? And what are the ramifications of those choices? And this is all the student talking to the client and then interfacing with me about, questions that she might not be able to answer. And they come up with a set of bylaws. And then those are the bylaws of the company. We also prepare minutes of their organizational meeting, a conflict of interest policy. All that stuff gets put together, signed, approved by the new board, and now SNAP exists. But it's still not a nonprofit. The next step is filing an application, which is a Form 1023 with the IRS. And in this particular project, there's the base application, and there's also an attachment because they were doing medical procedures. You can get approved as a hospital or a medical provider, and it's an easier approval process. And this was all something that the student researched and found to fill out kind of the attachment to the 1023 form, and then again interacted with the client to it's not just a fill-in-the-blank kind of application. There are descriptions of the organization and all sorts of questions that take kind of long paragraph answers that have to be gone over, and you have to make sure that they're not saying something that's going to be a problem or that you don't see any red flags in the application, so that you're teaching the client how to be a nonprofit through this whole process. The application gets filed, and then we prepare another follow-on one because you also have to file with the state of California. We prepare a memo that is the guidelines of being a nonprofit, and it talks about how to register with the Attorney General's office. We provide all that to the client, and that's the end of the project. So they get a minute book, and now they're up and running. You can go see them on the web, and that's an organization that we put into place. I mean, it's just one of many, but you can see that the student's experience in that is not just here's how you do it. It's a rich and kind of unbelievable experience. It's something that I wish that I had gotten to do in law school. It would have made me feel less clueless when I graduated. A completely different project would be one for a company called Trailblazing Tales. I think we have all sorts of clients, but this is really a good representative client of the types of people we have. So Trailblazing Tales is a company started by one woman who liked animals and she liked athletics and she wanted to combine them. And she combined them into a business where she takes dogs for runs once a week. Sometimes it's twice a week, and she'll approach dog owners and she'll have an ongoing agreement. She'll take them out for a run. And, that's it. It's a relatively simple business. But here's the deal. How do you protect somebody like that? So they come in and she says, this is my business. I take dogs out running. By the way, she's making it's a successful business. It's not just I have one dog that I go and run with. So the student and I meet with her and we discuss do you need an entity? Is this just a hobby or is this a business? And it turns out that it's a business. And then we say, well, what kind of protection do you need? You want limited liability? Well, what would be best for you? Maybe an S corporation, maybe an LLC. How do we decide that? And we talk about the various factors, and in conjunction with the client, we help them reach a decision about what kind of a company they should be. They decided to be an S corporation, and so the next step is, again, articles of incorporation, bylaws, minutes, various filings with the Secretary of State's office, the IRS, the Department of Corporations, preparing stock certificates, and the company's complete. But that's not the end of our work, because in this particular situation, Trailblazing Tales has their own clients. And one of the things that they do was TAI. I had the same question, by the way. Yes. So they have their own clients, and they need an agreement with their clients. And it's actually a great use of, it was a great project because the student had to think of a lot of issues that aren't typical in a business. So we have a form that's a base form. What do you do when a client renders services? And you want to say, here's what you're going to pay, here's what our job is, taking the dogs out for runs. But what are the terms of the deal? And having to think of issues like, well, what if the dog gets hurt on the run? Or what if the dog gets in a fight with another dog? How do we protect ourselves? And creating indemnification provisions in the client's agreement so that the owner is protected from instances that might arise in the course of conducting her business. So that was one agreement. And the other thing is, which is just this great exercise, is I could make a great 10-page agreement that would protect her really well. But this woman has a business where she takes dogs out for runs. She can't give somebody a 10-page agreement. She'd never have any clients. So we needed to create a one-page agreement so that it would be acceptable to her clients, and that involves making choices about what stays in and what goes out and what does need to be included and how much protection is enough, and communicating to the client, which is all done through the student, that this isn't comprehensive protection, that you're making business decisions about what needs to go into the agreement and coming up with a product that is useful in her business. So that was one thing we did, and then following that, the business was growing and she was hiring other people to take dogs out for runs occasionally, and we prepared an independent contractor agreement for her. And so the two agreements, so this was a student who had been working with the clinic for a while, so that project involved forming the business and creating two agreements for the client to use in their business. So just to give you a little sense, I usually don't actually read when I lecture, but I had a list of some of our sample clients. And there's many more, but I just wanted to give you a feeling of the variety and the depth of different people with whom we interact. So we have after-school enrichment programs, graphic designers, an internet magazine, a dance program for inner-city kids in downtown Los Angeles. That was a nonprofit. Several t-shirt businesses. I've got bread makers, cake bakers, and caterers. Those are three separate businesses. iPhone applications, preschool, electricians, landscapers, videos for kids, services for kids with disabilities, electric skateboard, a new purse design, kids camps, filmmakers, and a nonprofit to increase economic growth in undeveloped towns in Central America. That's a nonprofit. And that's just a smattering. There's this huge range of different experiences that the students get when they work in the clinic. One of the things that I found is a terrific byproduct of this is my students are, to the extent that any second-year students are, is they're having successes in their interviews because they're able to sit down at an interview and say, this is what I've done. I've formed a corporation. I created an LLC. I drafted agreement. And what's more, I've interacted with a client. I was the primary person responsible for this client. The client called me when they had questions. I responded to them. I had a difficult client, and here's how I dealt with it. And all of that really, really prepares them in a way to work, not that they wouldn't eventually get, but that puts them ahead of the curve once they're out there and once they start working. A couple of other really great things that happen as a result of the clinic. What I get to do with students in the clinic is take classroom examples and show how they apply. And because I'm teaching business organizations, that means that I'll sit down to the whole class and, of course, talk about piercing the corporate veil. And I think most of my students understand what piercing the corporate veil is. It's a relatively basic concept. But to see how it actually plays out, when the clinic students sit down to form a company, I'll say, here are the formalities we're following. And a client will say, how much money do I have to put in the business? And then we talk about adequate capitalization, which is one of the factors in piercing the corporate veil and why adequate capitalization is important. We had something come up just the other day where a client comes in and said, I work at a company, I'm part of a division in this company, the company is closing, but I'm being given the division to start as my own business, and the company wants some percentage. And the student and I got to talk about how that's the corporate opportunity doctrine. There's lots of other issues there too, but this is exactly the stuff that they're learning in class, and it gives life to it. On the flip side, I get to bring clinical experiences into the classroom, and even though, you can always tell war stories about past experiences, I get to talk to the broader group of students about things that are happening at their school. So I'll say, just yesterday at the clinic, this happened. A student earlier this week said, how do you decide if it's going to be an LLC or an S corporation? And I could say, we do that in the clinic all the time. And let me tell you, here are the big factors that we're learning about. But you know what? Sometimes it comes down to this $800 fee and the client deciding if they want to pay $800 up front and they don't choose LLC because of some random $800 tax. And so it's something that I would never have thought to teach about because it's not on my big list of important factors, but it breathes life into the subject matter because it lets them kind of touch it and feel it and see what's going on. The clinic, in order to exist, needs clients. And we have great students. We have a pretty good director, but it doesn't matter if you don't have work. And so what became important was, how do we create an identity for ourselves in the community? And so one of the things that we've tried to do is have a presence in the Los Angeles community where people know who we are and business will flow into the clinic. So one of the things we do is we created a relationship with an organization called SCORE. SCORE is the Service Corps of Retired Executives. And once a year we put on a seminar where the students will go and they will speak at a seminar about a selective area of business law. So one student might talk about partnerships and what's the exposure and liability, and another student might talk about shareholders agreements and various other topics. And the last few years there's been 100 to 200 people at these seminars, and that creates business for us, and it also gives the students a way to have another dimension of their experience, that they are experts presenting at a conference about a substantive area in their field of expertise. This year we've actually added a conference. We're doing the SCORE conference, and SCORE has combined with an organization called NABO, which is the National Association of Women Business Owners, and we're also doing something with PACE, which is a private business consulting group. We have connected with the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, the Inglewood Chamber of Commerce, the Pasadena Chamber of Commerce. We coordinate with public counsel on various things. Public counsel does a little bit of this work, but because they're publicly funded, they can't take anyone who isn't below the income guidelines. So there's a lot of work that they don't do. We have explored working with some law firms. Skadden Arps is starting a program where they want to do client counseling. So they called me up and they said, we want to do what you're doing. And I said, well, I kind of do what we're doing, but good luck to you. Then he called back and he said, well, what we found is we want this outlet for attorneys to counsel clients, but we can't really take them on as clients because it might create a conflict, and then we wouldn't be able to represent Citigroup or any of the other big companies that the small people might be dealing with. Would you take them? And I said, sure. And so we're talking with them about different ways to work together. One way is we're going to let their attorneys, put on a seminar, and then we will have some of the clients funnel to us, but also maybe working with some of their younger associates just to kind of talk about here's how you do it. Here are some of the issues that we found that arise in this area. And it's just another footprint. There's, out of these talks, other people approach us. There's the Los Angeles County Small Business Office, which I didn't know existed, but it turns out there's a business within Los Angeles, or a division within Los Angeles County, where they will teach small businesses how to apply for government contracts. And there was a big conference over at the Galen Center about 2 or 3 months ago, and we came and spoke at that, and got a whole new area of businesses, of kind of businesses that wanted to enter into the government contracts field. We also are integrating within the university. We work with the Stevens program at the engineering school. We have a lot of students that come from the business school that are working on businesses that want our help and advice. We've had, obviously, medical students, but we've also had people from the School of Education that wanted to start tutoring businesses. And so one of the nice things is there's some cross-pollination within other areas of the university itself. It's not really our primary source of clients, but it's a really nice source of clients, and it also creates a resource for the school, but it also is tremendous for the students, because one of the hardest things I have with students is getting them to take charge of a matter. In other words, it's really hard when you're 24, 25 years old to sit down with someone in their 40s who seems like they know everything and say, well, I'm the advisor, you listen to me. Even though that's what they need to do, because they know about the legal aspects that the client doesn't. But when you have a student who's their peer, or sometimes the undergrads are younger, it sets the perfect dynamic for explaining to the student, here's how you take control, and you're in charge. They are depending on you to shepherd them through this process, and it gives them a really good viewpoint of the role that they're supposed to play.